Thank you very much, everybody. Lovely to be here. Hopefully there'll be some new stuff in here because I was listening to the IPCC Working Group 2 press conference at 1 o'clock this morning, and I downloaded the report by 5 o'clock. So I'm going to talk about feed, food and fuel, plants and future securities. It is undoubtedly true, and that's what the title of the conference is about, that the plant science and plants themselves underpin so much of what we do on the planet and life itself. And one of the strange committees I'm sitting on at the moment is a science steering committee for the next World Expo, and the title of that is Feeding the Planet, Energy for Life. The same sorts of themes that are associated with your conference here. And I think across the whole suites of government, the issues of where plants are important is really at the forefront of thinking in a way that has probably never been the case in human history beforehand. So I'm going to talk through some of the major issues. I'm going to focus on food security, but of course the same sorts of things apply for fuel security and to a certain extent water security, but food here. So just a little bit about food security, because it's a phrase that we use all the time. There's a definition in the grey box up there, and it's essentially when people have access to the right sorts of food in the way that they can afford at all times. And because it's important, food security is important and increasingly important for reasons I'll outline in a minute, the UK government, in response to the Aquila meeting of the G8, effectively set up a whole range of things looking at food security, and GFS, the Global Food Security Programme, with all of these partners, is part of the kind of government response to awareness of the issues in a way, as I say, that hasn't been the case beforehand. So why food security? Why is it important? This is Marie Antoinette losing her head. She lost her head because there had been a succession of bad years for wheat yield. Food prices went up, bread prices went up to 80% of a daily working man's salary. That's what it cost to buy a loaf of bread. And that set people out on the street. It was the spark to the French Revolution. And there's lots of evidence now. This is food prices, FAO Food Price Index, the black dots, and where there's a red line, there is some degree of civil unrest. And you can just see by the grouping of those red lines where food prices go up rapidly, bang, you have all sorts of nasty things going on. And some evidence now that the Arab Spring was kicked off in part by food price rises. That's not to say food prices caused it, but they are the proximal factor that gets people out on the street, and so civil disorder becomes rife. So why is food an issue of increasing worry? Well, most of you will know all of these figures beforehand. By the middle of the century, a third more people, roughly. All of those people, and the middle class is growing very fast. The middle class is kind of moving the centre of mass from Europe and North America towards being in Southeast Asia and Asia more generally. Middle class is growing, and as people get richer, they eat more and they eat differently. And the world is getting increasingly urbanised, and people living in urban societies tend to be income rich, time poor. You go to your supermarket, you fill your trolley, you fill your fridge, and then you find your slimy food a month later or a week later and throw it out again. So just being urbanised breaks that link between you growing your own food and you respect your food, and you're going to make sure that all of that hard sweat and labour that's gone into it gets converted into your nutrition. When you live in a town, that gets broken, and so you tend to get more waste associated with urbanised systems. So all of these add up to the sorts of projections that you will have heard about. FAO says 60% more, David Tillman says 110% more, and there are a whole range of figures in between. But to put that in context, a number of people, including Jason Clay from WWF in Washington, say that if you take this figure, 60%, and you effectively project that forward, over the next 36 years to mid-century, the world will have to produce more food than it's ever produced in human history. That's the kind of scale of the challenge for that sort of 60% increase. More food than it's ever produced. Second major thing that's going on is that the world is getting more global. And I won't dwell on this, but I like this figure. This is not a map. This is just where ships carry food around the oceans. And you can clearly see where the continents are. With the food distribution. And actually the globalisation of food is important because what it means is that impacts in one place can very easily be felt around the rest of the world. And there is a supply chain risk associated with most of our global food system is a just-in-time culture. If the UK has something that breaks down our food supply, so this winter the storms almost overtopped some of the ports around the East Coast. Had that happened and the ports had gone out of action, we would have been in quite a difficult situation because we just don't have stores of local food. So the whole issue about the connectivity, and it'll become important in a slide or two later, is becoming really important. The world is changing. Okay, I used to have a whole lot of slides about history of climate change, etc., but I just put up these now. So if you just go through our last few seasons, we had the drought that ended with the wettest summer ever. Then the winter was largely okay, but this time last year, and it was this time last year, we had very deep snow. I couldn't go to a DEFRA meeting on extreme weather because I was snowed in by the extreme weather. Then we had what felt like a normal summer, but actually it was the 9th hottest on record, and then we've had the wettest winter in 250 years. I've taught statistics all my working life, and if you have a sequence of events, so you know if you want to roll 2 sixes, it's a 6 times a 6, you multiply probabilities together. If you just take the probabilities, roughly speaking, getting a sequence of extremes like we've had is about a 1 in a billion year probability. So about a billion years ago, we were largely unicellular organisms. That just kind of puts it in perspective. And actually, if you take the exact data for every season we've had since it started drying out in 2010, the chances of getting a sequence of extremes like that is about 1 in 9 times the age of the universe. And so clearly, that shows that the probabilities are non-stationary, the world is changing, the climate is changing, and our perception of more extremes, more variability in the weather must be due to climate change. And, this is where it gets all topical, we are on course for a world that's going to be 4 degrees hotter. This is, the black points are carbon emissions, and all of the lines are IPCC scenarios of different types. And as you can see, the black points are lying above this line, this red line. And this red line is the IPCC current worst case scenario. We are emitting carbon faster than the worst case scenario, even in this current IPCC. And that puts us on course for a 4-degree world. And 4 degrees doesn't sound too bad, but it is actually quite frightening. Here is data from France, normalized around the last century's averaged. This point out here at 3.5 degrees above zero, above average, was 2003. And in 2003, 70,000 people died, crop yields went down by about a third, 20 to 30%, but only because the worst of the heat was in July and August, not in May, June and July. The red line, the red histogram, is what is, roughly speaking, the worst case scenario for IPCC now. 2003 will be slightly cooler than average towards the end of the century. But the scariest thing is what happens if you're in a hot summer towards the end of the century. You're up 7, 8 degrees above normal, above what we consider average. If you put 7 degrees or 8 degrees above central England temperatures, then that takes us into the climate of southern Spain or northern Africa. And imagine what it would be if we have those years periodically, every 5 years or every 10 years. All of the plants that are associated with our temperate climate would struggle. We wouldn't have the oak trees left in our English countryside and so on. So it's not just the average, it is also the variability that becomes important. And this is a figure from Andy Challoner's Nature Climate Change paper last week, which, week before, which effectively is the first study to try and pull together some of the information on variability. And this is time out here, and this is change in yield, the variability of the change in yield. And as you can see, there's very little data, but as you go along from where we are now out, you have quite a large increase in scatter. So if you just take those data points, 2040, that suggests that variability from year to year is going to increase by about 50%. Out towards the end of the century, variability could go hundreds of percent. So what that means is In a bad year, for a given locality, I mean, Mike Bushell and I were just talking about it a little while ago. If the average yield is 10 tonnes per hectare or 8 tonnes per hectare for wheat in the UK, a bad year, it might be 3 tonnes, or it might be 15 tonnes. The variability is going to become really, really, really important, and it will be the determinant of the system dynamics. And this is data from today's IPCC report. This is just looking at change in yield. The orange colours are negative changes in yield, and the blue colours are the positive changes in yield across all of the simulations that are possible. And as you see, go through time, so this is now up to end of the century. Sorry, it's too small for me to see. You can see that there is a lot of variability, but the yellow and orange colours predominate. So yields are going to go down, that's what that's saying, because yields, there are more projections saying yields are going to go down than yields are going to go up. But the scary thing is not where the average is, and that's the much heralded 2 degrees yield decrease per decade over this century, not where the average is, but some of these projections are saying going down 25 to 50% for a given locality. And imagine the sorts of consequences that that will give rise to. So here is a map from a Foley's paper a few years ago in Nature. This is where the bulk of the world's calories come from. The bulk of the world's calories are associated with the major commodity crops: soya, maize, wheat, rice. This is a map from Joachim von Braun and Tim Wheeler's recent paper in Nature or Science, looking at the localized yield projections. And where it's deep red, it's minus 50%. And today's IPCC report puts some more flesh on that. But as you can see, different parts of the world are clearly affected in different ways. But if you look at where the major calories come from, Northwest Europe is about the only place where there might be relatively benign impacts of climate change. And even that, the Andy Challoner Nature climate change paper says we're increasingly going to feel yield impacts in the temperate zones as well. So ask yourself the question, this is the amount of global trade in agricultural product over time. We're living in this globalized world. If these places struggle to grow their own food in future, where will the food come from? They will either have to cope, or those places that can grow food will have to intensify in a way to provide food in aid or trade onto the global market. So the issue I want to emphasize here is that this is a global spatial game, and we're all part of this together. So if parts of the world don't produce food themselves in the way that we expect them to, those parts of the world that can will be under pressure to intensify. And so no part of the world, even if climate change is relatively benign, will go unaffected by some of these issues to do with climate change and food security. So that gives rise to a whole range of challenges. There is, to a first approximation, there's no more land available in the world for growing food. This is global agricultural area, 1.53 billion hectares of arable land, which is the greeny colours, 3.38 billion hectares of pastures. The only places where there isn't significant colour on the map are deserts or areas where there is rainforest. We don't want to lose the rainforest because carbon emissions, if nothing else. We also have an issue. If we have no more agricultural land and yield is going up, and demand is going up, then effectively we have to grow yield per unit area. But that increasingly is looking constrained. So here is data I put together a few years ago for an area in central Scotland, going back to 1700. This is the full time series and this is the post-war time series. And what you can see is that following the war and the nitrogen industry, switching from explosives to fertilizer, and the 1947 Price Support Act for Agriculture, huge impact in yields, and we have the Green Revolution. But you can see that over the last decade or two, it started to tail down, and that spline curve, the projection into the future, shows that yield growth is not increasing as fast as it has done historically. Here is data from one of Ken Giller's recent paper, which gives some indication of why that might be. Here are yields over time for a whole range of different places, and this is fertilizer use for the same sorts of places. And you can see with Europe, it has largely flattened off over the last couple of decades, but at the same time, our fertilizer use has gone down. Whereas other places where fertilizer use has gone up, yields haven't flattened off nearly as much. So one of the issues about the future is how can we grow yields, but how can we grow yields in a way where the environment is less impacted, where there is less use of fertilizer and a whole range of other things. And in a sense, that's one of the biggest challenges for your community. Yields are obviously something that comes out of the genetics interacting with the environment and interacting with management. G times E times M. And one of the things that I think is going to be important as we go into the future is recognizing that the E times M part of this is hugely important. So no matter what we might do in the lab or in our field trials, every farmer lives in a unique environment and every environment is different. And part of the future about being able to grow yields in the given range of given environments is going to be exploiting the plasticity in the genetics and making sure that it's locally suited to the environment. So it's optimizing at a relatively small spatial scale, whereas much of our big ag over the last 20 or 30 years has been about trying to find genotypes that are fitting right across the range of production space. But that contributes in itself to some of the issues around the yield gap, which needs closing. So I think a lot of the future is going to be about plumbing some of these things as well. Other issues, so we've got the declining yield growth. Part of the declining yield growth is climate change. There's quite a lot of evidence about that. Part of it is things to do with nitrogen optimization that I've talked about. But some of it might also be to do with soil degradation, because around the world, soils are increasingly under a huge amount of pressure. Some of the other issues that we have to cope with in the plant sciences area is the changing availability and the regulation of inputs. So in Europe, I'm often told that the European Commission would love to have a pesticide-free Europe because that's what consumers want. But clearly, if we got rid of pesticides, yields would go down enormously at a time when yields should be going up, and there are enough other challenges on it. So how do we develop new chemistry that is socially acceptable and does the job? Clearly, with climate change, there's going to be a whole range of new pests and diseases that are going to appear, a whole range of challenges associated with that. And as climate becomes more variable, how do we manage that variability within our agricultural systems? At the moment, we typically manage for the expectation. We manage for the mean. But as the world becomes more variable, managing for the mean will, as you start going from 0 to 200% of your expectation of 100%, if you get a couple of years of 0, you go out of business. So you're going to have to start within the farming system managing for that variability and finding ways, perhaps by growing different things, growing different cultivars that are more resilient, and so on. That's going to change the way that farmers do things. Clearly, water is also changing, and I like this graph. This just kind of illustrates for me some of the challenges. This is food supply in China, a developing country from 1960s up to just over past 2000. This shows that as the Chinese economy has grown, they have started to eat more vegetables. Great. And associated with eating more vegetables, the water requirement for growing those vegetables in terms of, this is cubic meters per person per year, has increased. But as they've eaten more meat and dairy, over time that's increased, you get this huge wodge of orange. That works out, putting it in kind of factoid terms, a family of 5 in China, now they're relaxing their one-child policy, you can have that, a family of 5 in China, to grow the meat and dairy that they now eat, takes an Olympic swimming pool of water per year. Just the meat and dairy, irrespective of all the other things that they consume. And by 2050, over half the world's population will not have enough water to meet demand. And the IPCC report this morning makes this quite clear, that water is going to become increasingly constraining, especially in the hotter parts of the world. So within that kind of agricultural economy, there's a whole lot of things that we know we can do better and know have to be the focus of some of our research. How do we manage soils better? How do we make the best use of our resources? So resource use efficiency, using new and best knowledge. So I was in Scotland recently, pissing with rain. Oh, sorry. It was raining very hard, sitting in an office watching a farmer plough up and down his hill. And all you could see, because it was raining so hard, was these parallel sets of streams coming down the hillside, taking soil with it. So it's not just about new knowledge, it's also clearly about using our best practice already. So a whole range of things around precision farming. Here's a picture from Simon, who's going to be talking later, with one of his the idea behind this image analysis system can recognize individual weeds. So you put it on an autonomous tractor, it trundles around and it can zap the weed without having to spray the whole field. Very resource use efficient. And then you reduce the impact of residues in your crop. Range of new chemistries and so on. But also quite a lot we can do better around forecasting using new computer technology, remote sensing and so on. And clearly, the role for new varieties, new genetics, however it is derived. Second challenge, what does land do? So land provides food, yes, and we know that, that's why we're here. It also provides water. It also, as we've found out this winter, provides a degree of flood defence. It's the home of biodiversity that actually helps agriculture. We use the countryside for recreation. The look of the countryside is has important cultural values for us. It is the home of iconic biodiversity like this skylark. It provides energy, stores carbon. All of these things are important for society as a whole. And somehow we have got to find ways of increasing yields without impacting on all of the rest of these. That's the notion of sustainable agricultural landscapes, in effect. Sustainable agriculture is not just about doing more with less. It is about finding ways of having countryside that can still look like this, still provide all of these other resources, but produce lots of that. And agriculture's footprint on the planet is huge and is contributing to some of the problems that we have globally. So I won't spend any much time on this, but a third of all greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture. A third. So that's more than any other industrial sector. If we want to move towards a low carbon economy and reduce some of the impacts of climate change, we've got to do something about that. And the other thing that's important, 25% of the world's soils are degraded. So sustainable agriculture, it's a challenge. How do we manage the land sustainably? It requires management of the farming impact within a field, but also management of the other bits of land around. So that's sustainable agricultural landscapes, but they require landscape planning. How do we do that? That's a big policy challenge, it's a big science challenge. How do we take each landscape that is different and say, this particular part of it should be set aside for biodiversity, this particular part of it should be set aside for flood defence, this particular part of it should be set aside for a buffer strip, this particular part of it for X, Y, and Z. How do we do that? But clearly, from an agricultural perspective, part of this is also about this G times E times N, recognising that every place is different and every place needs to be managed different, whereas a lot of our thinking and policy thinking has been about a one-size-fits-all. Third challenge. Who wins, who loses? I know this isn't typically what would be thought of as a science challenge, but nonetheless it's becoming increasingly important. We can talk about it on many different ways. Firstly, around the world, and I'll come back to this in a minute, cheap food is nutritionally bad. So the obesogenicity, the way that people consume food and its impacts on health, is often negatively correlated with the amount of money that you spend. So nutritional density changes. So as food prices are going to go up, and they will go up, how do we manage to provide food in a way that gets out of this bind that the poorest are the ones who suffer? Who wins, who loses? Then there are issues around agricultural land use that pertain to some of the multifunctions that land does that I was talking about in the last slide. So it's very easy for a landowner to drive their land intensity and provide a problem for somebody else through greenhouse gas emissions or downstream pollution or driving out biodiversity or any of those other sorts of things. So we have an issue where somebody gains, the farmer gains or the food industry gains, and somebody loses, typically the public. So there's a real challenge about how to avoid this tragedy of the commons, in a sense. How do we compensate the agricultural system in a way that yields are foregone for a public good? And of course, clearly, for those of you involved in the GM debate, there is a lot of feeling out there, whether you like it or hate it, there is a lot of feeling out there that GM is tainted by the fact that it tends to be associated with big business. And you know, this comes from a report published by the Oxford Farming Conference a few years ago. 4 companies account for between 75 and 90% of the global grain trade. You know, that concentration of power in a relatively small part of society is something that scares people. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong, it's just it is perceived as a risk. So just as an example of some of the issues here, this is oil palm. Oil palm has been one of the biggest drivers of deforestation in Southeast Asia. So converting rainforest into oil palm plantations. About 25 years ago, there was a very big conscious effort by the Indonesians and Malay people to stimulate agricultural production for palm oil. That led to this loss of local goods. So we've had forest clearances, biodiversity loss, orangutans, and a whole range of other things impacted. And that's led to a huge growth in the oil palm economy, which has led to a gain in private goods and gain in the country revenue. And I was talking to the Minister of Trade in Indonesia relatively recently, and he said he thought it was his duty to convert rainforest into money because that's what his country needed. And in a sense, he's an elected representative. That's the decision that can be made. But there is that kind of private loss, private gain versus public loss. So the place where I took a bit of issue with this Minister of Trade was he said he was doing it in the name of food security. But what has happened with the growth of the palm oil industry is that it's produced huge amounts of cheap oil that has been exported. And what that has meant is that food producers in the developed world have put more fat into food. And that more fat has led to all of us who eat processed foods increasing the fat content of our diet. And that has had a whole range of impacts towards obesogenicity and diabetes and a whole range of other things like that. So it's not straightforward that growing more food more cheaply ends up with a global gain in anything other than the financial actors involved in the system. A lot of the future has got to be around thinking about how we can manage diets in a sustainable way, rather than some of these issues around who has the power, who wins, who loses. Fourth challenge, coming to the end, it's not just about production. Food security is not just about growing food. It's also about managing the demand side. So here is a picture of the UK. Our agricultural land is in this browny colour or green, pasture land. The food that we waste in the UK comes from a land area about 91% the size of Wales. That's what we throw away. So we equivalently grow food from the area of Wales, it goes through the food chain, we spend money on it, and then we throw it away and it goes into landfill or composting, depending on your council. What Europe and North America throw away each year is about the same as the total production in sub-Saharan Africa. So changing our attitudes to food waste can free up a whole lot of land that could be used for something like biofuels, or it could be used for more sustainability. The final challenge around food security is reducing demand. And we've got to do something about this in the long run. There are more people now in this category globally than there are in these two categories. Here is a map of obesity in adults around the world. Yellow, it's still relatively small, but even in the developing world, you're starting to see in most countries a degree of bimodality. The very poorest are malnourished, and other people are obese. It's true in the UK, it's true in many, many different places. But the thing I just want to flag up, because this was on the news this morning as well, as Andy Challoner talking about his IPCC. The cost, so there was an ex-minister, a Labour lord, saying that we all ought to pay £10 a month or £10 a week for NHS costs. The reason that there is a black hole in the NHS finance is because diabetes is costing 10% of the whole NHS budget now. Diabetes alone is costing £30 billion a year in the UK. Obesity was last estimated to cost 15 billion in 2007. Given that the number of UK households that there are, every household in the UK is currently paying in tax between £2,000 and £3,000 healthcare costs associated with overconsumption. This recent report was the first big report of diabetes incidence in China, and they found that 12% of adults were already diabetic, though 4% had been diagnosed, but over 50% were showing signs of metabolic syndrome, so pre-diabetes. So whichever way you slice that in terms of a reasonable assumption about how many pre-diabetics will become diabetics, in the UK it's £1,000 per person who's got diabetes, healthcare costs. So you're talking about $300 or $400 billion out of the Chinese economy to cope with overconsumption diseases. So this driver, the public health driver, is becoming so acute around the world that has got to feed back into the food industry. It's got to feed back into the agricultural industry. And so the notion of a nutritious diet, as opposed to just a diet rich in calories, is really going to start driving some of the research agenda over the coming decades. So just the feed issue. A lot of what we eat, which bits of it may be bad for us, but a lot of what we eat is meat around the world. 36% of the world's calories at the moment that are grown go into feeding livestock. 36%. And the demand for meat is going to increase over time. Here is a map of the world's calories. Where it's red, those calories don't go into human feed, they go into biofuels or livestock. And the growth in demand for food, for meat, so feed for animals, is huge and is a really big driver of environmental impacts. Here is a report, this comes from a report by the Environment Working Group in the US. Just put things a little bit in context. If everybody in the US ate no meat or cheese just one day a week, over a year, it's like not driving 91 billion miles. So one day without meat or dairy a week, summed across the North American population, is like not driving 91 billion miles in cars. Pete Smith, in a recent paper, part of the IPCC Working Group 3 report, showed that actually if we all changed our diets and ate what was healthy, it would decarbonise the agricultural system much more, perhaps twice as much more, of thinking about every techno gimmick that we can to reduce carbon in the agricultural economy. So changing diets, both by freeing up land, reducing resources, reducing nitrogen inputs, etc., making us healthier, making the environment healthier, has got to be part of the future. But of course, the food system is a complex system. We have a whole range of different actors. Food is produced, it impacts the environment, it goes through sort of retail chain, we choose it, it impacts on our health, nutrition and well-being, and so does the environment impact on our health, nutrition and well-being. There isn't a single entity that's in charge of that. So it's difficult to imagine how the food system will change voluntarily unless we, as citizens and consumers, say we want to eat in a different way and we want our food system to be different. So I've got 5 minutes left. Let's just whiz through them. Where does plant science fit in? Clearly, crops fuel the world. We know crops fuel the world. Everything about the agriculture over the next decades has got to be driven by the sort of research enterprise that you guys are doing on a daily basis. But also, agriculture, as well as being the world's biggest employer and the world's biggest land user, is also the world's biggest polluter. And somehow we've got to find ways of managing agriculture in a way that becomes more sustainable. There has been a lot of work recently around uniformity. So big monocultures around the world of us eating just so much of so few crops is increasingly going to be a risk as the world becomes more variable. It's going to be a risk from disease and climate impacts. A risk from health. So there's quite a lot of discussion in the food retail chain at the moment about how by having bred for yield, we have bred starch, which is relatively fragile, which falls apart quickly, which gives you a glycemic boost, which increases your chance of diabetes. So there's going to have to be a change in terms of thinking about not just growing more calories, but the nutrient content of the food. And so we might be in a situation in the future where the sorts of plant science is not necessarily going to be concentrated on 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 crops, but we'll have to think more about much more diverse systems built around nutritional needs rather than just growing yield. So this nutritional agenda. And then the final point I'd like to say, because clearly within the plant sciences community there is a great acceptance of the need for doing GM and a whole range of other things. We can't push our opinions on people out there. We have to be much more engaged in the social debate about the costs and the benefits, which require us as scientists to be able to respect and understand a whole range of different drivers that underpin people's concerns. And I was at a meeting in the Food Standards Agency a couple of weeks ago where we were talking about risk, and there were a lot of people that got up and said the government's current push towards GM, saying if you're not for GM, you're against the modern world. And Owen Patterson saying at the farming conference that we don't want Europe to be a museum of farming. That was backfiring because it was hardening people's opinions about GM. Because effectively you're saying it's black or white. You're either with us or you're the enemy. And actually, whenever there are examples where governments have done that sort of thing, all it does is shut down innovation and it hardens people's opinions and it becomes much more of a politicized debate. So part of where we have to go within the science community is willingly get engaged in some of these debates. Right from the start, not say it's not our business, not say we will do it at the end of our research project when we've developed our 20 tons of wheat variety and we want to roll it out. We should be all vocal champions of where we are. So here's my final slide. This came from 1917, just as the US were entering the First World War. US Food Administration. These are exactly the same messages that we're still talking about almost 100 years later. Okay, thanks very much, everybody.